Everyone, welcome. I'm Sarah Samuels, the Programs and Communications Manager. We're so excited to have this very timely special briefing on Gateway and the post-COVID economy. A very, very recently released report on scenarios for future growth and Trans-Hudson travel. So kicking off our presentation, we're very lucky to have Brian Fritsch, and I'll give a quick intro of him. So he joined RPA in 2019 as the campaign manager for the public for Penn and Build Gateway Now coalitions, which ABNY is a part of that coalition, before being named communications director in early 2022. During his time at RPA, he's also worked on federal relief funding for the region's transit agencies, housing reform in Connecticut, and increased capital funding for NJ Transit. Before this, he ran the Education Coalition High Achievement New York and served as outreach director for the New York City Department of Education Pre-K for All expansion. He's managed campaigns for many different politicians over the years, as well as being the finance director, among other roles. He holds a BA from Grinnell College, an MBA from CUNY-Zicklin School of Business, and lives in Brooklyn with his family. So thank you so much. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the ABNY team for helping to pull this together today. Yeah, we're thrilled with getting this report out to, answer the fundamental question of, is Gateway an increased capacity between New York and New Jersey under the Hudson River necessary in the post-COVID landscape? That was like the fundamental question we were asking ourselves when we started to put this report together 6 or 7 years ago. And that's what we will try to answer for you tonight. If you're not familiar with RPA, we're a nonprofit research planning and advocacy organization. We've been around for 100 years now. We're celebrating our centennial. As some of you maybe have heard, we're planning a big exhibit at Vanderbilt Hall at Grand Central Station for later this fall to really bring RPA's history and the history of the New York City region out to people, which we're extremely excited about. And sharing the many successes and many failures that this organization has had over the years, good ideas and some not so good. This is our region. I think all of you are probably quite familiar with it. I think the thing that I like to mention about this is the 782 municipalities that make up this region. Having even a nonprofit entity like this one to talk about good governance across borders, I think is extremely beneficial. And that's, the one thing where we're so connected, but sometimes we're very divided in the way that we do land use, do zoning, do energy and environment policy and transportation and housing, the things that RPA works on an everyday basis. It's really helpful to have an entity to kind of shine a light on ways we're doing that well and ways that we could make significant improvements. I think probably many of you know that the backbone of our work, we are guided by our 4 regional plans that we've done over the basically once a generation over the years. Specifically looking at Trans-Hudson in the recent past, our 3rd regional plan talked a lot about access to the region's core project, which the plug was pulled on by Chris Christie 12.5 years ago now, which would be probably done and complete at this point, which is quite unfortunate, I think. It would have added a significant amount of Trans-Hudson capacity to the region had it been done. But its predecessor, which we discussed in our 4th regional plan, the Gateway program, which is primarily what we're talking about tonight, was discussed in our 4th plan, which was released in 2017. We talked about it in a more holistic way, a long-term way, as part of what we call our T-Rex plan. It envisioned a fully integrated regional rail system that we thought would be beneficial over the long term. Not something we're totally getting into tonight, but it kind of that's the concept, that's the idea that we've been working towards as an organization for a number of years now. We've talked a lot about Trans-Hudson service over the years. We've released a number of reports looking at what the impacts ARC would have on property values in New Jersey, for example, or the preventable crisis report we put out in 2019. What would happen if we weren't able to build a new rail tunnel and the existing tunnel would have to shut down for an extended period of time? You know, we forecasted for that report $16 billion of negative economic impact nationally in that piece. So it's something that's been in our sight lines for a long time. And this is a big reason why, I think. You know, just fundamentally, Manhattan's an island. There are only 6 crossings between New York and New Jersey. All of the rail and transit crossings, with the exception of the Lincoln Tunnel bus lanes, were built prior to or over 110 years ago. So it's been a long time since we've invested in our rail transit infrastructure between the 2 states. You know, it's just, we're so much better connected to Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx than we are to New Jersey. It's been a long time since we've done anything considerable. And that's borne out by how people travel to and from Manhattan over the, you know, this is 2010, but you know, the concept is still the same. If you live in the 5 boroughs but not in Manhattan, you're probably getting to Manhattan by the subway, like for the most part. There are a few drivers, obviously, but they represent a fairly small percentage of people traveling to and from the core, and some bus ridership where a 2nd Avenue subway should probably be on the east side. But if you live in Long Island or the Hudson Valley or Westchester, you're getting in through fairly decent Long Island Railroad and Metro North service, depending on your opinion on that. But when you see New Jersey, it's a hodgepodge. Like, there's good rail service if you live in Essex or Union County, good bus service in parts of Hudson and other places, and a lot of people still driving, especially folks coming from Bergen, Passaic, Rockland County, New York, coming over the George Washington Bridge. And I think that's one of the things that I think the Gateway program wants to address is we have mass transit deserts in a very quickly growing part of the region. I'm just going to go really quickly through these just to show you commuters into Manhattan from New Jersey have gone up exponentially over the past 30 years. That's 20, this is 1990, 2010, 2019. And this is the overall change. You know, it's very, it doesn't match what's happened in New York City, to be very clear. But New Jersey, as far as commuters outside of the 5 boroughs, has really gone up incredibly. And that's because there's the housing production in northern New Jersey is much, much higher on a per capita basis than it has been in other parts of the region. And Chris is going to get into a little bit more of that in a second. So to meet this increase in demand we've seen over the past 30 years, the Gateway program, after the demise of ARC, was suggested by Amtrak starting in 2011, 2012-ish, and it includes a number of different projects that are all in different stages of development. I can talk at length on any of these as needed, but the ones that I want to point out right away are the Portal North Bridge, which is now into the construction phase, which is essentially the busiest part of the Northeast Corridor with only 2 tracks. And it is an old swing bridge that often gets stuck out of position, needs to be sometimes sledgehammered back into place to make it functional again to let trains go over it. There's a nearly $2 billion project to replace that with a high-span bridge that doesn't need to open when boats travel underneath it on the Hackensack River, and the Hudson Tunnel project, which is through its environmental review process now, and we'll get into a bit more of the details of that later. Those are the first 2 pieces of Gateway, the phase 1 projects, along with the concrete casing to make the connection between the tunnel and Penn Station happen underneath the expansion of Hudson Yards, which is being constructed now as well. So back to the initial question that I posed at the beginning. This is what's happened with ridership of NJ Transit and Amtrak through the North River Tunnel, the existing tunnel, since the start of COVID. You see that, it went from nearly 5.5 million riders per month down to nearly nothing by May of 2020. Has since seen a fairly steady return to travel, with the exception of the Omicron wave earlier this year that has the dip at the far end of the graph on my left. So, we wanted to know, like, what is the impact of this dip in ridership over the long term, and why do we need this project? So first, I'm going to introduce Chris Jones, who's our senior fellow, a longtime RPA staff member who's worked on economic development and planning projects for maybe longer than I will talk about. And then Tiffany-Ann Taylor, who is our fairly new VP of Transportation, will talk about some of the specific Trans-Hudson ridership models that we've developed for this particular report. So, Chris?
Great. Thank you, Brian. And thank you for not saying that I've been around longer than you've been alive, but we'll take it for what it is. So Brian covered where we are today and what preceded it in terms of growth in Trans-Hudson ridership, changes in infrastructure, the gaps in infrastructure that we had going into the pandemic. And I'm going to cover the post-COVID economy part of this. And then Tiffany will pull both of those threads together for us and talk about what that implies for transit and then the project itself. So we actually started these scenarios not with Gateway in mind, like I'm sure all of you, ever since this pandemic started, you're just trying to think about what's going to happen afterwards. What of all of the things that have come into place are just a temporary blip? What are the things that are going to fundamentally change the way the city and the region operate, the way we live, the way we work? And I think even where we are today, 2.5 years later, we still can't answer those questions. And the only way that we can really do this is by looking at different scenarios for how the future would unfold and putting some brackets around that based on some reasonable assumptions, looking at where trends go, and then making some educated assumptions about what's the range of things that could happen for the things that we're unsure about. But we applied this first to the Gateway project, and we put this into the report that we released, I think, last week, not the week before. And it's important to say what the report does and doesn't do. First of all, it only talks about Gateway in terms of what types of demand and infrastructure can be built there. You can make implications about that for subways or Long Island Railroad or whatever you want, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. So I want to make caution people about that. We estimated Trans-Hudson travel under different scenarios over 20 and 50 years. We actually did this by decade. And you needed to do this for 50 years, even though who knows what's going to happen 50 years from now. But Gateway is going to be around hopefully for 100 years. And it's going to take over a decade to build. So you have to look out that far for it to have any meaning. We didn't look at intercity travel. So even though Amtrak is obviously an important part of this, that wasn't part of the numbers that we looked at. And we don't try to get so fine to predict, how many New Jersey Transit riders will there be going into Penn Station at a given time. It's really just overall looking at Trans-Hudson demand and Trans-Hudson travel demand in particular. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And just one point to say that, we talk about these different futures that could unfold. And it's important to remember that the future isn't just something that happens to us. It's something that we affect. So as I show these scenarios, how they unfold, which they will, which one is more likely. Some of that has to do with forces we can't control, but some of it are very much things that we do, where we build infrastructure, how much new housing we build, and for who, what happens with just basic services, basic quality of life and costs here in the region. So just keeping that in mind as we kind of go through this. It's not just, here's what might happen and how do we accommodate it. Next slide, please. So first, we just to lay out our assumptions, and I think for an exercise like this, the important thing you do is you kind of lay out your assumptions for it, and then people can pick apart at it, and there are numbers in the report for most of these. But first, to understand, what are the things that we can pretty much count on happening? And I think everybody is pretty convinced now that both remote work and e-commerce are here to stay. Lots of questions about how and where and how much, but they're here. One thing that a lot of people didn't think going in the early stages of the pandemic, but we felt pretty strongly and feel even more strongly now that New York City is going to remain a leading global city. This is not the 1970s when it was preceded by a couple of decades of manufacturing leaving, white flight to the suburbs. The city was doing about as well as it had in, since the early part of the 20th century and the decades leading up to it. And for a number of reasons, all the things that made global cities, an era where they were strong and New York City thriving, and those things still exist and those assets still exist. Climate change, demographic change, they're pretty much baked in to a large extent. They could unfold in different ways, but we know that the population is going to get older. We know that it's going to get racially diverse just by looking at kind of the different demographics of people who are younger and people who are older. And we count on fear of contagion fading after the pandemic. And for that, we just looked at history. After the 2018 flu pandemic, people didn't start avoiding activities after it ended. After 9/11, a lot of people thought that people would never fly in an airplane again, or they would never build tall buildings in New York. We built more skyscrapers since then than ever before. Airplane ridership went through the roof. And I think you're seeing signs even now that it's going to take a while for many people. I'm one of the more cautious people, I will admit it. But I don't think that the kind of the lingering fear of the pandemic is really going to affect behavior quite as much. But the remote work phenomena is one of the things that has really exacerbated underlying racial and economic inequality in the region and the country since then. And unfortunately, with all the good things that come with working remotely, reduced commute time, et cetera, it does have a very big risk of exacerbating inequality because the people who have the choice to live at home, and they tend to be higher income, they have more options available to them, and that type of divide could continue to grow unless we're very intentional about addressing it. Energy and fuel prices likely to be more volatile, and this is one where I think not everybody would think intuitively, but work from home is more likely to decentralize population than it is jobs. And when you think about it, if you're somebody who is who works in Manhattan, and you suddenly you don't have to commute as much, there'll be a greater tendency to live farther away from Manhattan. But if you're an employer and you're trying to reach as many employees as possible, it still is very important to have a central location. And even if people are working, just 2 or 3 days a week, they still have to come in on those 2 or 3 days a week, and you want to reach as many as possible. So those are the things that we think are assumptions as a backdrop. If you go to the next slide. These are the biggest wild cards, and I'm not going to go into them in any great detail here, but obviously, how much and pattern of working from home, we don't know. Climate change could unfold in a number of different ways. National trends for the economy. Immigration, I think, is a very big one. It's largely dictated by national policy. We've relied on immigration for both population and economic growth for decades. And if that closes down because of national policy, that would have a big impact on the region. And if you go to the next slide. So I'm going to spend a little time on this slide because this is really the foundation of the analysis and the output that we did. we took those different trends. We looked at historically at what some of the numbers are. We did modeling from land use and transportation models that we had previously. And we developed these 4 different scenarios for how the region could unfold for the 2 things that are going to affect Trans-Hudson traffic the most. One is just how much we grow in terms of population and jobs and where that growth occurs. And the other is how much will people be working from home. And I'll show you in a second how we came to some of those assumptions, but we did these 4 scenarios along these 2 poles of growth and work from home. So the vertical axis there goes from low work from home to high work from home. And low work from home is still twice as much as it was pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, about 12% of the population, 12% of work, 12% of office workers work from home. Post-pandemic, we're saying that would increase to twice as much, to about 25%. And then we did, for both of these, we did a low growth scenario where growth was about half of what it was in the 30 years leading up to this, and a high growth scenario where growth was almost as high as it was prior to the pandemic since 1980. And then for our 2 high growth, our 2 high work from home scenarios, we assumed that work from home would double for the workforce as a whole. I mean, would quadruple. For the workforce as a whole, that means increasing from 5% to 20%. For office workers, it means increasing from about 12% to about 50%. So half of the work time for office workers would be from home. And if you go to the next slide, I'll break these down a little more. This is what it looks like in terms of jobs and population growth. And these are similar to what some other forecasts, including ourselves, have done previously. But under a low growth scenario, we would still grow from almost 12 million jobs pre-pandemic. You can see the big bounce back just in the decade between 2020 and 2030, and then grow to something over 13 million jobs. In the higher growth scenario, grows to almost 15 million. And population, we go from about 23.5 million, where we are today, to about 28 million under the low growth scenario and about 31 million under the high growth. And this again is over a 50-year period. So it's so if you look out 10, 20 years, obviously it would be less than that, but along those trajectories. And if you go to the next slide. So we looked a lot at different assumptions about work from home to see where we would bracket this. And again, these are the numbers I showed you before. We had and they Jonathan Witzel is the chief economist for McKinsey. Nicholas Bloom and his associates are academics at Stanford and other places, and Patricia Mokhtarian is an academic at Georgia Tech. And they all came up with different, but very thoughtful and I think defensible projections for how much work from home can grow. Jonathan Witzel is at the low end, growing about doubling. Bloom and his associates are at the high end, going from about 20 to 25%, and Patricia Mokhtarian is pretty much in the middle. And if you look at where we are today, right now about 49% of office workers are in the office. Manhattan office workers are in there on an average day. Actually, no, my mistake. Right now, it's more like 36%. The 49% is what the Partnership for New York City projected with their employer survey would be in the office in September. So with the assumption 6 months from now, we'd be about half full. That's close to the high projections that we have. So that's a wide range. And if you go to the next slide, it's also, very different by industry. About 2/3 of the workforce, really doesn't have an option for working from home. And they tend to be in lower wage jobs, as I said, retail, leisure and entertainment, manufacturing, whereas things like office jobs, et cetera, are, have more mobility and have higher rates of telework. You go to the next slide. So we distributed jobs and population, a bit differently. Again, we looked at historical trends and how the different economic patterns could affect them. In our two low work from home scenarios, we had jobs in New York City grew slightly faster than the rest of the region, and that's jobs have been growing quite a bit faster than the rest of the region over the last decade, but over a long term, we would expect that to moderate. But population grows about 1.5 times outside of New York City as it did, and we distributed a little differently among suburban areas, which I'll talk to in a little bit. But if you go to the next slide.
So why don't we just continue to walk through the scenarios quick while we're figuring out the details. Did everyone kind of understand how we put together the 4 scenarios?
Yeah.
You know, growth being on basically a historical trajectory of increase, and our low growth scenario being approximately 50% of what growth has been over the past 50-ish years. And with work from home, you know, with the high work from home scenarios, we see it increase to approximately 4 times what it was pre-pandemic. And on the low work from home scenarios, it's twice as far. So we've developed these 4 scenarios that we've put together to take a look at what jobs and population will look like. Can you go to the next slide? So this looks at job change in the 4 various scenarios, which are represented with the different colors here. Obviously, way more jobs just generally, like in gross in the city in northern New Jersey. But you can see the difference between the high growth scenarios and the high work from home scenarios, and where the distribution is in this slide. I'm sure Chris would have something profound to say about it. But to look at, you know, where low work from home scenarios are, so the red ones, for example, and low growth scenarios, you see a clear difference of where they're happening and where they're not. Next slide.
Oh, sorry, I abandoned my post.
It's all right. But population change tells a slightly different story on where the distribution occurs. It happens a little bit more outside of the core of the region in the higher work from home scenarios than it does. And, you know, just generally, if there's lower growth, lower population change, higher growth, higher population change. Thanks, Sarah. Next one. All right. Any luck with Tiffany?
Can you hear me now?
Connecting a Bluetooth speaker to the laptop, which shouldn't solve it all. Sorry about
All
that.
right.
No.
Sorry to cut you off there, Chris. So just, we can go through some of this generally. I think I understand it well enough. So I think the main thing that we wanted to say in this report is that, you know, if you invest in infrastructure, ridership will follow. And that's the one thing that we think is really important. There are profound difficulties and shortcomings with not investing, as we talked about in our last report of preventable crisis. And in this one, we wanted to talk about the positive impacts of investing in mass transit.
Sorry.
And another important point that I think I can kind of see on the screen is that no one really wants to go back to 2019 levels of ridership. It was too crowded. It was not particularly healthy. It was a little bit inhumane. There's a reason why people, when people started to travel after the initial lockdown, they immediately you saw a huge increase in car travel. People didn't want to be back on mass transit as quickly as they were as otherwise. And you saw, I think, when we were at like 80% of car trips back across the various crossings between Manhattan and the rest of the region, transit ridership was only around 30%. It jumped to 45% when car crossings hit about 90%. So just that once it became intolerable to travel by car back into the central business district, people were like, okay, maybe I could take the train. It's not as crowded as it used to be. And then when it hit 100%, which is essentially where we are now, freight, and I will say that freight trips in and out of the CBD and the rest of the region are well past pre-COVID levels. Then now we're seeing about 60% transit ridership levels from 2019. But I don't think anyone wants to be back into those types of crowded situations that happen, that were far over capacity, both for the subway and especially for New Jersey transit riders prior to the pandemic. Next point, now we've seen this this is a trend that's continued, unabated by the pandemic. Discretionary trips, weekend, off-peak trips have gone up much faster than commuting for work trips, and that's continued. We expect that to continue over the foreseeable future. And the next point,
I'm talking now.
Well, Chris mentioned that about 2/3 of the labor force are able unable to work remotely at this time. We do expect that percentage to slightly increase over the foreseeable future. And this kind of leads into the last point, which is that, we saw this incredible peak in ridership, especially over the morning commute, but over the evening commute as well in the past. As a result of the pandemic, those peaks have leveled out a lot. People are coming in maybe earlier, or a lot of us, I think, are coming in later. I'm certainly one of those. And we see those peaks a little more evenly distributed over the course of the day. And that's good for our mass transit system, because we couldn't sustain those, especially the more inconvenient peaks that were incredibly high. We've gone over this slide already, so I'm not going to reiterate it. So work trips grow more than work from home in scenarios A and B, and less in C and D, and that's looking at the absolute change. But I'll say what's interesting about this to me is you see auto, which is this red bar looking at Trans-Hudson trips. That's just a result of how little capacity there is in the system for more cars to go to and from New Jersey on a daily basis. If we are going to get more people in and out of the central business district, we need transit to move that number of people. And while the amount, you can see in, for example, the higher work from home scenarios over here on the right, it takes longer for transit to bounce back to pre-pandemic levels. But we will get there regardless of whether growth is anemic or growth is quick, and whether work from home is high or low. It's just it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, essentially. And you can see the bars here, the gray one, before we switch to the next one. We are counting work from home people here in this area. This is a significant increase. It makes a huge difference in whether people are staying in New Jersey or not. But again, we need to continue to invest in our system if we're going to grow as a region. Next slide. All right. So this kind of shows a little more clearly when the commuters will exceed 2019 levels. So it takes a little while for most scenarios. What I'll say is this is an average of the days. So for example, even in scenario D, which is the most pessimistic, it's high from home, most people not coming into the office, and our lowest growth scenario. On higher days, especially I think most people are coming in Tuesday through Thursday. We've seen that in some studies, this ridership is considerably higher in the midweek days than it is on Mondays or Fridays. That number will be up considerably on those days. But you see the high end, let's say 2050 for the high end scenario, it's 100,000 more riders just coming in for community transit. That's way more than the current system can currently currently accommodate. All right, and then if you look at all Trans-Hudson trips, not just transit, that shows the incredible need more directly than even the transit trips. So that's the difference is clear. Like there's a if we have our current infrastructure, we'll have a more difficult time accommodating the growth that the region will want to have over the coming decades. Yeah, so this is our main takeaway with transit trips in particular, a 50 to 30% growth over what we had in 2019 by 2050. So just kind of putting a fine point on it, even in the lowest scenario, this is still a 15% growth over what we had previously, up to about a 32% growth in the foreseeable future. And the other point that I'll make is, the main part of the Gateway program, the Hudson project, it's going to take about 10 years to complete that project in its entirety. So that's a long time for us to bounce back past these 2030 numbers, closer to 2040.
Thank you, Brian. But you all heard much of the conversation before. We're just continuing to reiterate the point that it is still important to invest in our regional transportation infrastructure, because for the most part, majority of the scenarios are still showing significant growth over the next 20 to 50 years. If you've been closely looking at the digits on the last few slides, especially where it's saying 2040 seems to be much more of an inflection point, I'd like to remind us that that's actually not that far from now. It's only about 20 years. Next slide, please. Great. And just continuing to hammer in the point, obviously you can see the dip in early 2020, where our lives have changed forever, for sure, in the transit world. And then as we're approaching 2030 and 2040, all the scenarios really start to increase the trends for the average weekday trips. And then based on the associated colors from each of the scenarios, you can see how they start to differ as we pass, really, I would say the 2050 mark, but still overall continued growth. Next slide. Great. So, excuse me. So important other conclusions, any further delay in the series of Gateway projects will absolutely impede recovery. I'll reiterate again, we still need to be able to accommodate growth in the region, even at our current rate of development. And unfortunately, like many other things in our region, without supporting the continued need for infrastructure, the essential workers and others who can't work from home, as Chris alluded to before, would bear the biggest brunt of that delay, and that riders are less likely to tolerate poor and crowded service. I think one thing that I've learned, especially in the transportation space, is because the shift in regular traditional peak hours and peak days of the week has completely changed because of work from home, and how folks are really starting to use transit or increased use of transit for their non-work trips. That means that the quality of service and the experience of service is actually more important than arguably it ever was before. So as I mentioned in the chat, if you were able to see before the pandemic, the summer of hell, as it was quoted, for our regional rail system was not that long before. I believe it's like 2017 or 2018, and no one wants to be able to revert back to that level of service. And so making sure that the ride is comfortable, frequent, efficient, perhaps has updated peak travel service is really important. Gateway will reduce the number of cars that have been on the road and improve air quality and absolutely get us closer to our region's sustainability goals in reducing harmful emissions into the atmosphere. With work from home, Gateway, having it completed will absolutely limit suburban sprawl. As was alluded to before, work from home will still exist and folks still need to be reasonably close to downtowns and still need accessible transit, even if it's for non-work trips as well. And as I mentioned, for sure, considering climate change in our region, completing Gateway is going to get us another step towards meeting our region's sustainability goals. Next slide. And I'll turn it back over to Brian, I believe.
Yeah, so I think the one thing I wanted to mention, right now with the Hudson Tunnel project in particular, we're working to get a full funding grant agreement done. That's as advocates for this project, that is the next thing, the next really important step for us to move the project forward. And what we need to get that done is both states to do an MOU agreeing to funding the first stage projects, which is the Portal North Bridge and the Hudson Tunnel project, kind of as a package, and to really identify closely where those funds are coming from. If you want to show the next slide. It's not an inexpensive suite of projects. Portal North's about a $2 billion project, Hudson Tunnel's a little over 12, and that number is sure to go up considerably because of inflation and the fact that we've had a lot of delays, mostly from the Trump administration, trying to get the environmental review done. We lost a lot of time over the last few years. But also, there are other very expensive parts of the project that we think are beneficial in order to unlock the necessary capacity that the Gateway program brings, including Penn expansion and the renovation to the existing part of Penn Station. So, we anticipate that the two states, New York and New Jersey, are going to need to kick in between $6 and $8 billion for this project, and the feds will do somewhere between 18 and 24. There are some parts that might have a little bit more than, it was all supposed to be 50-50 between the feds and state, and there might be, because of the IIJA bill, the infrastructure bill that passed last November, there might be some pieces of the projects that will come in at a little bit higher than 50%, possibly as much as 80%, but that's all a little TBD. So we're waiting for more guidance from the feds on that. And just to kind of give you a glimpse of when the Hudson tunnels come in, what that will mean, you'll almost be able to, if you're standing at Penn Station, you'll almost be able to go through the new tunnels on all platforms except for tracks 21 and 20, which are served right now exclusively by Long Island Railroad. Once that comes in, I think it's interesting to just look at where the tunnel will connect to the rest of Penn Station once it's completed. Next slide. And just a more of a bird's eye view. Obviously, a lot happening around Penn that we didn't really touch on in this report, but is a big topic of conversation right now between the renovation and expansion. Metro North Penn Access coming in, building new stations in the Bronx, which is a project that we're huge fans of, and East Side Access opening up later this year, which will actually take some of Penn riders, approximately half, maybe slightly less, out of Penn Station and into Grand Central starting in October. So yeah, that's I think the long and short of it. I want to just say thank you to Ellis in particular, who carried a huge load on doing the background research for this report. Chris, Tiffany-Ann, and Rachel Weinberger from our team for hammering it out and putting it together. And finally, ABNY has been an excellent partner on Everything Gateway program over the past few years as part of our Build Gateway Now coalition. If any of you work for organizations that would like to be part of that coalition, we would very much welcome you. There's no fees or anything to join. We just take whatever time and attention you're willing to give. So we would love to have you as part of that. If you have a business or a nonprofit that would be willing to engage with us on that work. So thank you very much. Any questions?
I was curious, like as far as the construction costs are concerned, like what is the breakdown of where those costs come from, and is there anything that like can be done either either the political level or is like the government level that maybe would bring down those construction costs? I know like other capital projects in the region tend to have like a pretty high costs associated with them. I'm just kind of curious like, what you guys found to be a cause of that.
Chris, do you want to? I don't know if you can talk. Yeah, I can hear you.
I can talk, but you need to repeat the question.
Oh,
maybe
as far as
use the phone as the microphone. Move it
yeah,
closer.
yeah. Okay, go for it.
I'll make a mistake again. I was just kind of curious, like, what was if you guys had did any research or found any kind of like, identified any major causes for the cost of the project, and if there are ways that, hypothetically that cost could be bring down either with like regulatory change or other kind of delays that cause that to increase.
Sure. Not as part of this report, but we have looked generally at, what really drives the cost of large transit projects. We did a study a couple of years ago on MTA projects. So one of the things that, and basically the answer is that it's a little bit of everything. It's everything from, procurement rules to the amount of time that environmental review processes take. A lot of it is the stop and starting of funding. So and when you think about it, if you got to, start a tunnel boring machine and then stop it, take it down and put it back up again, that's a lot more expensive than just running it straight through. As a matter of fact, that's kind of what happened with ARC the first time around. They were starting to dig and they had to stop. So the longer it takes, the more expensive it gets. The more stops and starts there are, the more expensive it gets. But there's certainly, there's certain things that you can do with infrastructure projects that you can, that you can standardize. Like Madrid puts in subway stations very cheaply because they just have a one size fits all. They do the exact same thing, exact same materials, exact same design. Gateway is not something that you replicate. It's like a one in a whatever, in a decades long project. But there's still, if you ask me, is there more that could be done to kind of hold the cost down? I'm sure there is, and I'm sure that's something which needs to be a focus. But we're not talking about major cost reductions at this point. You're talking about things that you can do at the margin.
I would just add the one thing that GDC has been doing that they've been bullish about is trying to share data with private firms in like sort of in an open way about like what does it look like underneath the Hudson River? Like what would it be like if your company was going to join us and be part of this in boring under the river? Because no one's done it since the Lincoln Tunnel opened. Or finished construction, half a century ago, and that just helps everyone. It just helps reduce risk for the project, and risk is a major factor in driving up costs, along with time too. And like any information that they can get out there and share with the firms that are going to be doing the construction work in earnest is helpful, I think, in the long run. So that's one way. Yeah, I will say the Hudson Tunnel project in particular started out as a $12.7 billion project 5 years ago now, and the price hasn't gone up because they've been able to reduce the risk cost over that time. It's 12.3 now, and inflation has been a real bear over that time. Like that's $2 billion of the project's cost now. So it's been a major impact, but they've been able to mitigate it just by doing as much as they can with the resources that they have so far.
Hi. So this is a really fascinating topic, and it came in a little late, so I don't know if it's already covered. I just want to bring up two questions. The first one is, I wonder if the team has conducted any community outreach. Have you talked with the residents, talking with the community boards and the organizations, and what are some of the strongest voices of support, and what are some of the other voices in consumer games project. The second question is, I think like, we are all seeing more and more blueprints come out of the new administration. And one thing that's really touched about in a lot of blueprints is to say the job class are now distributing across the outer boroughs and outer boroughs and communities in Brooklyn, so not just really centered in downtown and midtown. So how can this project also benefiting to both employees of those outer boroughs or residents of outer boroughs?
I'll take that first question quick and then turn it over to Tiffany-Ann for the second. Did you catch that one? Okay. Yeah, so we've had a coalition going since 2018 on this project, and we've talked to mayors and New York City Community Board folks, city council members from pretty much every town you can think of in New Jersey and elsewhere. But this is also like a regional project, right? So a lot of statewide organizations on both sides of the river see the need for it. Yeah, I think for the Hudson Tunnel project in particular, and building more capacity under the Hudson River, there's concern over the cost and some of the tax burdens and the other things that are related to that, but a real sense that the infrastructure will pay for itself back over the 100 years or so that the project will be in operation. So that's been a really good thing. Tiffany-Ann, do you want to take the second part of that?
Sure. I think the question was generally, how does a big project like this still benefit folks who live in the other boroughs? Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think, it's important to remember that this project, just like anything else, is part of a transportation network. And so that means that when something happens on one aspect of the network, it still does affect, it could be a secondary or maybe even tertiary effect, but it still does affect other aspects of the network. And so, I mentioned earlier on some of the slides how this is another project that can help get some of the vehicles in the region off streets, right? You're still encouraging folks to use public transportation. So that's one way. Another thing is to remember that there are actually other mega projects happening in the same time span, although there's probably less clarity on them. You still have congestion pricing, which is set to go in effect really the next year or so. You also have the plan to restructure or reconfigure the BQE, even if that is pushed out maybe 5 years or so. There are other projects in the area that are going to make driving less desirable, and again, pushing folks onto public transit. And if you want to make sure that the experience for riders is still enjoyable, and not that we're crammed or not that the system is failing us or that trains are late, we still need to make investments in that part of the system. I think the other thing that I would also add is that although it's not something I think that we're thinking at the forefront, remember that there are people who are doing reverse commutes as well. So I think initially we're thinking people are traveling back and forth between Manhattan as a central business district and perhaps northern New Jersey, but you also have folks who are doing not only reverse commute, but also commutes from the other boroughs to New Jersey, or from the other boroughs to other points of connection through, Amtrak lines or other lines that are supported by the Gateway network. So I think that to think about how it benefits, it really does benefit the region. It is a series of really important projects. And then I think the other thing that I would add is Brian talked about it on the image that had like all the 10 or so projects in entirety. Some of the projects like the Portal North Bridge actually affect, or rather their dysfunction affects the efficiency of the rest of the region, right? So if something is happening on something like Portal North Bridge, Amtrak is virtually shut down at parts of the corridor. So you also have to think about the fact that it's not necessarily an immediate benefit that you're looking at, but really how does the benefit radiate through other parts of the transportation system?
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Please eat the rest of the food and drink the rest of the wine. And happy to chat more if you'd like.